Hello and welcome to another podcast on the channel New Wave History. This is Ali Wasi and I'm hosting Yousuf Nazar today, who is a top investment banker and has a keen eye for Pakistan's economy and is an expert on Pakistan's political and economic history. Yousuf Nazar recently wrote an article for the Friday Times in which he argued that Zulfiqar Ali Bhutto's economic legacy is often misrepresented and he's vilified for trying to fix the structural problems that plagued Pakistan's economy. The article is on Friday Times still. You can read that. Its link is in the description. Thank you, Yousuf Nazar sir, for joining us. This article is a fascinating read for someone like me who's interested in Pakistan's political history and grew up believing this narrative that Zulfiqar Ali Bhutto's nationalization process stagnated Pakistan's investment in Pakistan, and the country has never been able to recover from that ill-conceived action. We've also heard that the reason why he felt that he had become unpopular in the public ahead of the 1977 election was that he thought that his economic performance had probably failed him in public eyes. You, on the other hand, argue in this article that the GDP growth rate under Zulfiqar Ali Bhutto, one of the indicators, of course, one of the very important indicators, was about 4.85% between 1972 and 1977. But we can see that it was very high in the first 2 years, 1 or 2 years, somewhere around 7.1%. But that was immediately after the 1971 war and the growth that it happened, but it can be attributed to the post-war bounce. But during the later 4 years, the growth rate was roughly around 3.4% or slightly above. But so when you say that the growth rate was 4.28 or 4.8%, whatever, despite all the floods and oil price surge, etc., don't you think it's slightly misleading because it was great in the first 2 years but dropped sharply in the later years?
First of all, let me get your what you said. Let's get the facts right. Mr. Bhutto took over in December 1971. So the data I'm talking about is like from 72. Pakistan's fiscal year goes from, as you know, from July to June.
Yes.
So I'm talking about if you begin from June, July of 1972. Because the first 6 months immediately after the war, it is not really very relevant to compare the performance. Those were very, very turbulent times. So that is my, I think, first point. And if you look at from that viewpoint, it is not 4.1%. It is, I said, for the 5-year period, it is about 4.85%. And variations happen, sometimes some years growth are low, and so you cannot really say it is a trend. Otherwise, I'm looking at the averages. Other point is that if you look at the 12 months period, Mr. Bhutto was overthrown in July of 1977. Immediately after his removal in the first year, there was a strong bounce back. I don't think it is fair to attribute that strong bounce back to Zia's rule. There is nothing he did that you can say it was due to Zia.
Agreed.
So I have to attribute it to Mr. Bhutto's period, particularly because the Tarbela Dam became operational and its benefits from both higher water availability as well as higher power generation came to be visible. And that is a matter of record, and it is not a conjecture. So if you include that here, the immediately the period 12 months after Mr. Bhutto's removal, I won't go further. Then the average growth period, actually GDP growth goes to 5.3%. Another point. From September 1973 to March or the spring of 1974, the oil prices rose from roughly about $3 a barrel to $12. That is a fourfold increase. That is the biggest oil shock the world has ever seen. And that resulted in very high inflation worldwide, as well as, recession.
Yes.
And the 70s recession and, inflation is legendary because the oil price shock was so severe. We are talking about recently oil prices going, up by 30%, 40%. Here I'm talking about 300%. So
Yes.
that is an extraordinary, shock, given that Pakistan continues to be, and was extremely energy dependent. Uh, uh, so that you cannot ignore. It was not an ordinary development, and you have to take into consideration that it came immediately after, I mean, like 2 years roughly after the dismemberment of Pakistan. So just imagine the country breaks up, right?
Hmm.
Pakistan's biggest source of export earnings, more than 60%, was jute that came from East Pakistan. Now,
Yes.
in September 73, you have another huge oil shock. On top of it, you have 1973 floods, and also in 1976, the worst at those times, which really the estimates that I have go into hundreds of millions of dollars. That growth has to be seen in the context of these catastrophic developments. So no matter how you cut it, it is either 4.8% or 5.3% average. And that's where I think the problem lies, that a lot of the people, when I am addressing the criticism on Mr. Bhutto's economic performance, that is the overarching thing, not discussing one macro indicator or the other. People who say the nationalization damage, let me submit it to this way. I'm not saying it because I supported Mr. Bhutto. I'm saying it because this is not only my profession, that is my, area of core expertise, emerging market economics.
Yes.
And from that perspective, industrial production was hardly 13% of the overall economy at that time. It wasn't that relevant. The gainsay, the core of the economy was agriculture. And
Correct.
despite the fact that these floods came and this happened, the economic performance, I would say, that was, very quite robust. And if you just look at the averages, I understand that the averages are averages, but you know, we don't have a better indicator other than the GDP growth and the averages to comment otherwise. Otherwise, it all gets very subjective and very emotional. But I'm trying to steer away from that, pattern, a very subjective or emotional, evaluation, and saying, let us look at the data. And now I will come to the second point, which is often very overlooked. That is the actual production of main crops,
Hmm.
because that is what is relevant that was relevant to the majority of the population and the workforce. And if you look at the actual production of crops, not just the actual production, but also the yield. So I have cited something which is directly from the 1986-87 Economic Survey of Pakistan. Now, that survey was not published during Mr. Bhutto's time. And you can see the figures, and I posted it in my Twitter, and the figures I have cited are from that Economic Survey of Pakistan. Actually, the agriculture production, namely key crops, wheat and rice, increased on average compared to the previous 5-year period, both in terms of absolute production as well as per acre yield. And that is something that, or there's people very casually overlook and just say the Bhutto nationalized the banks, the economy was destroyed. That is the narrative we have been hearing. And that's what I'm trying to say. That is pretty much nonsense, and that's a very one-sided view of what really happened.
Right.
So that is what I've tried to say in my article, and I come to the second point in inflation. Inflation, if you see, despite Well, what do you expect? We had, and the oil prices went from $70 to $120 recently from 2021 to 2022, right? And we
Yeah,
also had a devaluation. Now, inflation hit the highest ever 38% in September of 2023.
correct.
That we did not hit even during Mr. Bhutto's time when the oil prices rose by, 4 times in a matter of 6 months. So what does it tell you? Are we willing to say that the economic performance of Mr. Shehbaz Sharif or the hybrid government was much worse than Mr. Bhutto's government? Well, if you look at the inflation, that's what you would conclude. I'm not saying you should just look at the inflation, but I'm just talking about how you can, look at the facts and, basically make conclusions. But even despite that huge price shock, the inflation did not go to 40, 50%. It stayed, remained, around, 20, and then it came down subsequently. Because inflation is not something, as we all very know, that, just look at few months or a couple of years and say, well, that was bad. Inflation builds up, due to shocks, and then it goes down and gradually, and you have to look at 2, 3 years period and say, what was the trend? Well, it did go up, but it also started coming down. By the time Zia took over, the inflation had come down, the agriculture production had revived, and the economies bounced back with a, GDP growth of, as I said, in the first of Zia. Let me give you the exact number because it's important. In that time,
In
immediately after that,
1948, it's roughly 8%.
it is 7.8% to be exact.
Yes.
So it was not a coincidence that the 1 year in the last of Mr. Bhutto's year, it was 2.8%, because of the cumulative effect of, all these developments I just described. But the next year, it bounces back and bounces back strongly, 7.8%, which is one of the highest, in the last, uh, uh, decades, post 1971 period. So how is that possible? I mean, obviously, Zia could not, was too much preoccupied with, persecution of Mr. Bhutto and the People's Party. It recovered because of all the factors I have discussed. And that was not a coincidence. And that's what I'm trying to highlight, that it is the way the narrative has been built. That's my main point. The narrative has been built. First of all, it is not based on facts. Number two, it is heavily biased, and I want to come to that heavily biased point. Let me pick an example of Mr. Shahid Javed Barki, the erstwhile economist. Mr. Barki, of course, he's a professional economist, but he worked for the World Bank. So he never worked in the private sector. And I don't have a very, very high opinion about people who have never proved their worth in the private sector, to be honest. World Bank guys are bureaucrats, and people don't talk like this because I really personally, I don't care, because even though I may have some personal relationships directly or indirectly, you know me that well, very well. Mr.
Yeah.
Barki is also first cousin of Mr. Imran Khan. Mr. Barki was also served with the government immediately after the dismissal of Mr. Benazir Bhutto, in 1996,
90. Yes.
right? So, and people often cite that he really, I said, well, you have to look at the credibility, not just the credibility, but of the credentials about being neutral or independent. The facts I'm just describing to you do not suggest to me that his views can be totally independent, and especially in the context of our culture, our society. He is the son of a army general, Mr. Wajid Ali Barki, General Wajid Ali Barki, who was, who worked for Khan and also served as acting president. So what do you expect from someone who comes from Mr. General Barki's family, who's a cousin of Imran Khan, who served in a government as a de facto minister of finance, which was this government, it was establishment, and then Worse, these gentlemen do not discuss the facts I have just described. And sir, what the numbers I'm quoting you, they are not like I'm not making them up. As I said, these are from the Economic Survey of Pakistan, published after Mr. Bhutto's assassination during Zia-ul-Haq's time. And somebody
Correct.
asked me on social media that, well, he said, well, we have to check with other sources. Now, the problem is that the critics don't even know that the only source of macroeconomic indicators is the government of Pakistan, the Economic Survey of Pakistan. The World Bank and the IMF take those figures from the government. They don't
Correct.
make those figures. So I'm quoting the only official source that is available, because we don't have any independent think tanks or economic research organizations that can calculate the GDP and inflation independently. So I'm quoting the only source that we have got, and that is something that has been overlooked by so many people conveniently, because they will tell you stories about Mr. Bhutto was an autocrat. Well, I'm not discussing that he was not an autocrat or not. I'm not discussing whether he dismissed the governments in KPK and Balochistan. No, that's not the subject of my discussion. What I'm saying is that this myth that has been created, that Mr. Bhutto destroyed the economy, is absolute rubbish. And I say someone as someone with a 30-year experience in emerging market economists, as someone who worked the largest bank on the Wall Street as a chief strategist. And so please do not tell me that Dr. Ashraf Hussain says so. I have never been that blunt before ever in my life, but somebody ask me. There is somebody who is a doctorate, in some university, California, Davis. He said, but Mr. Ashraf Hussain said so and so. Dr. Burki said so and so. And I was very blunt about it. I said, sorry, I don't want to blow about the credentials, but let me tell you something. I had a major, much bigger job in the private sector in the global financial industry than either Dr. Ashraf Hussain or Dr. Shah or Mr. Shahid Javid Burki. And I know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, let me come to the nationalization of banks in 1974. By the way, Ali, I want to also add one thing. I directly deal debt with Pakistani banks because I was responsible for lending to the Pakistani nationalized banks in the 1990s.
Correct.
I was someone who sat on the credit committee of the bank and approved the loans and credit lines to these banks. So I'm intimately familiar with what the banks are and what they did. So
So
my
no,
second point.
your credentials are beyond reproach. I'm not talking about.
No, no,
I
no, no.
know.
I'm not saying it for you. I am saying it for the audience, because I have received a lot of these questions, and through the courtesy of your podcast, I am kind of trying to answer those. And I will be
I,
very frank. Many of these comments have come from the PTI supporters. So I'm not saying it for your benefit. We know each other well. I'm talking
I
about other people.
and the numbers you quoted there, authenticity is beyond any doubt, because those are the only numbers that we have. Those are official numbers, and they were the government that followed Bhutto's government, which was not only his opposition but also killed him actually. So there's no doubt about the authenticity of the numbers. But what for example, you're right about the things that you pointed out about the credentials of the other people that you have mentioned here. For example, Shai Javed Barki or other people. But the thing that most people often argue is that uh, the nationalization process was, for example, you have actually mentioned in your article that in 1976 he went on to nationalize Guinea mills or the ghee factories or the flour mills, etc. And that was basically to fill those companies, those product, those businesses with political parties, his own political parties' workers. And at one point, the number of employees in those factories almost doubled. So and their labor productivity actually declined, which paved the way for the future governments to actually employ more of their political parties workers in the same institutions. For example, we know how the Pakistan steel mills, we haven't been able to privatize it. Pakistan International Airlines, we haven't been able to privatize it. We had to give huge golden handshakes when we did eventually manage to privatize Pakistan Telecommunication Authority. So these things that people mention, that because of this political involvement of certain of governments, successive governments. It's not just that Pakistan People's Party or Pakistan Muslim League Noon. Every political party has done these things, and this was the way was paved by Zulfiqar Ali Bhutto's nationalization process. How would you argue with that?
I will be very frank. These people don't know nothing about economic planning or industrial development. And let me explain this, why I'm saying this. It is not about the nationalization per se. Let's get some few facts, in order first. Banks were nationalized on 1st of January 1974.
Yes.
Mr. Bhutto was removed in the July of 1977, about 3.5 years, right? There is no evidence that Mr. Bhutto used it to basically, fill, the banks with the, People's Party workers or supporters. So that's simply not true. That did not happen. Number two, Mr. Bhutto gave a capital allocation of about $500 million to the fertilizer industry. That was probably the single biggest investment that was made in the industrial sector by his government. Who he appointed? He appointed one of Pakistan's most respected industrialists, Syed Babar Ali,
Yes.
as the chairman of the National Fertilization Corporation. Now, you might have seen his interview with, Jugnu Mohsen recently. It came, I think it was on TV. Mr. Babali said that Mr. Boo appointed him and gave him this big allocation and say, build fertilizer factories. And according to Mr. Babari himself, Mr. Bhutto did not even once interfere in his work. And I'm talking about a very substantive thing. A $500 million investment at that time was a hell of, was a very huge sum. We're talking about 70s. And according to this person was appointed on merit completely because, Mr. Bhutto was not friends with the, these industrial families or the packages group or Waziri Industries. He actually nationalized some of them. And that's why Mr. Babar Ali said that actually people said that, he won't like it if you don't accept the offer. But look at the offer. He goes out to searching to someone who is very, competent, who is not his friend, and asked him to build the fertilizer industry in Pakistan. What does it tell you? And that is a matter of record. You cannot make this up. And the evidence is coming from someone whose own industry was nationalized by Zulfiqar Ali Bhutto. And it is coming now, 45 years later. He didn't have to say that to Jugni Mohsen, but is, gracious of him and good of him that he's put it on record. So that basically is a very strong rebuttal of the argument, which is based on a lot of hearsay and, innuendo that he interfered. He did not. There is no evidence for that. I mean, you can tell me a lot of his stories, but what I just quoted comes from someone who suffered from his nationalization, yet praised him. So this is what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to separate the facts from fiction, from hearsay and all this to something very, very concrete facts. Now, as far as the subject is concerned, that, well, if people who came in power later on, let us take the example of the nationalization of banks, who abused the banks the most. there is a lot of evidence to suggest that it was under basically Zia and Nawaz Sharif that the banks. Banks' most precious loan is loans. Politically, loans they were used, and also for politically driven objects. Just in the Yellow Cab scheme, $500 million, were allocated to the Yellow Cab scheme, roughly, and majority of the loans, went bad. And so, if you like to hold Mr. Bhutto responsible for the bad loans that were made during Nawaz Sharif's time, and therefore the banks, became weaker, I don't know what to say about that. And even if the subsequent People's Party the governments did not, do a good job, obviously you cannot attribute it to the fact that they were nationalized during his period. Hello?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Okay, so now let me make another point. People say, no, the nationalization itself was wrong. And they talk about Korea, for example. South Korea, this would happen, this would happen. I've asked many people, including some of my, colleagues in the banks. My question was simple. Do you know that the President Park of South Korea nationalized the banks in 1961? General Park ruled South Korea from 1961 to 1979. His period, forget that he was a military dictator, that he was, yes. But he is also credited with the great transformation of South Korea from a, poor agrarian economy into a, industrial powerhouse. And the nationalized banks under his watch played a critical role in the allocation of credit and in the industrial growth, which was an export-led growth in South Korea. Now, you can tell me it is one country. Not quite. Taiwan, too. Taiwan, the banks were under state control for a very long time, from the late 40s to the 1980s, and remained so. And there, too, the banks under the state ownership played a very critical role in the industrial development. So you got those two countries. You say, okay, well, maybe exceptional. Well, let me come to another country, a smaller country, Singapore. Singapore, even today, it is biggest bank, the DBS, the Development Bank of Singapore, is under state control. So if you want to suggest that there is a problem per se with the state ownership, you have to give me some evidence, not to persuade me. But when I look at these examples, I'm not persuaded that it is just the fact that the banks were nationalized. All the banks were nationalized in Taiwan and South Korea as well. And these guys, their progress is legendary. So what was the issue then? I think the governance was the issue, the political governments were the issue, particularly Zia and Nawaz Sharif in subsequent years, because they ruled for most of the period after their time. Of course, Benazir came, but Benazir Bhutto, we all know, didn't have much power, and she ruled for spurts of 1.5 years to 2 years and so on. So for a big chunk of the time, it was either Nawaz Sharif or Zia basically, now Nawaz Sharif, mashallah, has become a Democrat, but that's only a recent development. All those time, the 90s and the 80s, Nawaz Sharif was effectively a part of the establishment. So we conveniently ignore all that. And by the 90s, the banks, some of the banks, I can say, were technically bankrupt, including United Bank and Habib Bank. What was the reason? These political loans. Moin Qureshi published, the list of loan defaulters in 1993. People can see it for themselves. They were not people affiliated with Pakistan People's Party or with Mr. Bhutto. They were people who belonged to the establishment or had ties with the establishment, and therefore to lay the blame of the woes of the nationalized bank at Mr. Bhutto's, footsteps, I think is a gross distortion of history. And why it has not been said? Because we have been ruled by the establishment so long that people don't say these things because they want to be in the good books of the establishment. Now, I'm one crazy guy who openly speaks about it because I don't need a job. I don't care. I'm more interested in the facts. I'm more interested in what the numbers are telling me and what makes sense. So the banks, yes, they were technically bankrupt, but that's in the 90s. You are talking about the development in the 90s. People have been saying this and laying the blame on a poor guy who was removed from power in 1977 and hanged in 1979.
Yes, but at the same time, sorry, I'm interrupting you, but you see, once you open the gates for this process, you might not be able to manage where it goes from there. For example, you just mentioned that Zia and Nawaz Sharif's policies were the main cause of this decline in the banking sector. But I also gave you examples of PIA and Pakistan Steel Mills and PTCL, etc. The number of employees in these organizations far exceeds their requirements, and so I mean, the people of Pakistan, have to somehow to bear all the brunt. They become a burden on the state, the next national exchequer, because the state has to continuously then subsidize them in order for them to exist. So this is the main point I'd like you to address, that the policy incorporated by Zulfiqar Ali Bhutto, it went on to make it worse for these institutions and corporations.
Yeah, it is generally said, but I just give you the examples of Korea and Taiwan and Singapore.
Hmm.
Does those facts tell you that the policy is wrong? No. Actually, the state-led planning, state-led development has been the norm throughout Asia. What about Vietnam?
Hmm.
Okay. I mean,
The biggest
people
example is China,
generally
maybe. I
pe-
mean, you're
people
right.
people generally see South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore as the countries, following free market model, right? But a lot of them just don't know. They don't want to say that actually in these countries with the so-called free market economies, the banks were under the state control for decades. So
Right.
what is the problem? With the state ownership of the banks, or with the people who are managing it, or with the rulers who misused it for political ends? And
So your argument would be,
let me also give you another example. The banks were nationalized because majority of the loans were basically being distributed to the group companies. That was the problem. That is why Dr. Mehboobullack said that these 22 families, they're controlling the entire industrial structure. So the credit did not go to small enterprises. It didn't
right.
go to the agriculture sector, for example. Now, isn't it corruption that you use the public money? The banks are funded by deposits, right? So when you use public money just to grow your own industries, right? That is also
Hmm.
corruption. That is private sector corruption.
Yeah.
You can't just say that. I mean, there is nothing black and white. And then let me ask you this. Mr. Bhutto was, removed 45 years back. What happened? What great progress our textile industry has made since then. These guys still, are in the low value added segments. What does it tell you?
It's true.
Is that the public sector is the only problem? They cannot survive without all these concessions, rebates, concessional pricing, and all that. People talk about, people just very conveniently forget that, yeah, there is, overemployment, and there's a lot of, problems in the public sector. Let me give you another number. Last year, according to the Economic Survey of Pakistan, tax exemptions or subsidies to the private sector and all these industries total 5.8 trillion rupees. That is $21 billion. And somebody in a recent group chat was raising that Benazir income support program, is a waste of money. It's creating dependency. He said, how was the allocation last year? 600 billion rupees. Well, that is about $2.1 billion. I said, do you know what were the exemptions granted to the private sector and all that? Exemptions in 2000, last year. That's $21 billion. I said,
$21 billion.
You don't mention $21 billion, but you have a problem with money being distributed, and that is also peanuts. 3,000 rupees a month is nothing. The way,
Yeah.
Pakistan, the inflation is Pakistan. And you say this is a waste of money. But there is a very toxic and biased thinking that has, become mainstream in Pakistan. Every newspaper, I won't hesitate to say, Dawn, the News, the Express Tribune, and all these channels, Geo, Airline, all these, because this has become part of the mainstream. People repeat these things without even thinking that they are losing the perspective. To criticize Benazir Income Support Program, which is, as I said, the last year was 2.1 billion, and ignore and don't even mention that the exemptions and all those subsidies, aggregated to $21 billion, it tells you a mindset that has become almost toxic, and it ignores what the rich, the powerful, and the elites of Pakistan get, and yet takes exception to other things like, there are overemployment in PIA. Yes, there is. But do we know the whole picture? We don't. I mean, you talk about the steel mills, but in steel mills, yes, people, were hired, but who abandoned it? Why? What were the reasons? Are we saying that we don't need steel products and we need, these fancy sugar mills? The people who built sugar mills and still making money and milking it, they didn't want to build the steel mill. That's a bigger issue. And how can a country develop its engineering and basic, industry without steel? Nobody does. But we forget these bigger questions and get into this thing that, well, the politically motivated appointments were made. It has become a buzzword to just dismiss everything which is more substantive, in my opinion, which is more important. The question should be, what do we need to do to develop our industry? We have been, an agro-based country for decades because our industrial class finds it convenient to make money from sugar and textile and stuff like that.
Right. So
And
thank you.
and you take the auto industry that survives on protectionism. Put the tariffs high so that they don't have to face competition from overseas, and then you can continue to make money. So this rent-seeking model that we're talking about,
Yes.
that is the rent-seeking model that Mr. Bhutto tried to change. He had his faults. He made many mistakes. There is no denying that. But let us be sensible. Right now, what is the status in our country? It took 45 years for the Supreme Court to acknowledge that injustice was done to him. And if that is the state of the affairs, you can very well imagine what has been done to what he actually did and what people allege that he did. And that is the historic wrong. I'm making a very small, very feeble effort to correct that. Well, let us rethink, let us look at the facts, and let us also break this myth that only the private sector led development can transform the economy. Actually, it is both public sector and private sector. But if the managers are so bad, as we have experienced in the last 40 years or so, then it doesn't matter what private sector or public sector, the results will have been the same as they were, as we have seen for such a long time.
Right. Thank you, Yousuf Nazar, for addressing some of the myths that have been created over the past many years by the state institutions. And I must say, it also includes certain interest groups that have done this. I think the article was exceptional. I honestly feel that this is the kind of debate that we have to have in the public sphere more often, because whenever we discuss these things with our neoliberal economists or managers and CEOs of certain companies and owners of the companies who have actually gone on to become politicians, top politicians in the country, they're completely averse to the idea of having anything to do with the government-led enterprises, for example, dismissing them and the nationalization process as if it only wielded bad results and that it had nothing to do with bad governance or anything. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. The fact is that the last time real wages increased in Pakistan was during Bhutto's nationalization period. Thank you again for your time, sir. The article is available on the Friday Times website. For the people who might be interested in reading it, they can go and read there too. The link is in the description. And this is Ali Wasi from New Wave History signing off. Until the next time.